In September 1991, two hikers were crossing a glacier high in the Alps when they saw something poking out of the melting ice. A head, shoulders, a human body, face down in the meltwater. They assumed it was a climber, some poor soul who'd slipped years ago and never been found. They were wrong by about 5,000 years. The man in the ice had died before the pyramids were built, before Stonehenge, before writing existed anywhere on Earth, and for the next 10 years, everyone believed they knew how he died. A tired traveler, caught in a storm, lying down in the snow to sleep and never waking up. A sad accident. Then someone took an X-ray, and a peaceful death in the mountains turned into the oldest murder case ever discovered. A homicide with a victim, a weapon, a motive, 4 people's blood, and a killer who got away with it for 5,300 years. This is that case file. Act 1. The body in the ice. To understand why this is a murder investigation and not just an archaeology story, you have to understand what was found in that ice, because it wasn't a skeleton, it wasn't bones, it was a man. The glacier had done something almost no other place on Earth can do. It had frozen him, dried him, and sealed him away so completely that 5,300 years later, we still have his skin, his hair, his fingernails, his organs, his eyes. We have the very last meal sitting in his stomach. We even have his clothes, a coat of stitched animal hides, leggings, a bear fur hat, shoes stuffed with grass for warmth, and his gear laid out beside him like an inventory. A bow, a quiver of arrows, a wooden backpack frame, a flint dagger, and a copper axe, a rare, valuable, high-status tool that tells us this was not some nobody. Scientists named him Ötzi, after the Ötztal Alps where he was found. And over the next 3 decades, they studied him more closely than almost any human being who has ever lived. They counted 61 tattoos on his body, not decorative, but clustered over his joints and his lower back, in the exact places he suffered from wear and pain. Possibly the oldest known medical treatment of its kind, a prehistoric attempt at pain relief drawn into his skin. They sequenced his entire genome. They found he had brown eyes, not the pale-eyed, light-skinned caveman you're picturing, but darker skin and dark eyes. They learned he was lactose intolerant, that he had heart disease, that he had worms in his gut, that he was around 45 years old, genuinely old for his time, about 5'3", and worn down by a hard life of walking these mountains. We know what he ate. We know what he wore. We know what hurt. We know in extraordinary detail how this man lived. For 10 years, the story ended there. A Copper Age traveler who died in the cold. Case closed. Filed away as an accident. But there was a detail nobody had looked at closely enough. And when they finally did, the entire story collapsed. Act 2. The X-ray that changed everything. Around 2001, a decade after he was pulled from the ice, researchers ran a detailed CT scan of the body. Just imaging. Routine. And deep inside his left shoulder, the scan lit up with something that did not belong there. A dense, triangular shape. Sharp. Man-made. A flint arrowhead. Buried in his back. Take a second with that. For 10 years, this was an accident. A man who lay down in the snow, and the whole time, hidden inside his shoulder, where no external examination had caught it, was the stone tip of an arrow that someone had fired into him. This was the moment the case changed, because you do not accidentally get an arrowhead in your back. Somebody shot him, and the wound tells a story of its own. The angle shows the arrow came from behind him, and from below, meaning the person who killed him was further down the slope, lower on the mountain, shooting up at his back. He was moving away from his killer when it happened. He almost certainly never saw the arrow coming. The arrowhead tore into the tissue of his shoulder and struck near a major artery, the subclavian, one of the big vessels feeding the arm. For years, the accepted conclusion was brutal and simple. It severed the artery, and he bled to death within minutes. More recent forensic work has complicated even that. A 2025 reanalysis of the scans suggested the bleeding may not have killed him instantly, that he might have survived in agony for longer than we thought before he died, which, if anything, is worse. It means his final minutes on that mountain may have been slow, but here's the detail that turns a shooting into something colder, something premeditated. When researchers examined the wound, the stone arrowhead was still inside him, but the wooden shaft of the arrow was gone. Someone had pulled the shaft back out. Think about why you'd do that. In a world where an arrow's fletching and markings could identify whose it was, the shaft was evidence. Pulling it out and taking it away is the act of someone who did not want to be traced. 5,300 years ago, on a frozen mountainside, the killer cleaned up after themselves. This wasn't a hunting accident. This was a killing, and the killer knew it. Act 3. The struggle. Once you know a man was murdered, his whole body becomes a crime scene. And when investigators went back over Ötzi with that in mind, the evidence of violence was everywhere. Start with his right hand. Across the palm, between the thumb and the index finger, there was a deep cut. Not a scrape, not an accident of the ice. A slicing wound of a very particular kind. The kind you get when someone swings a blade at you and you grab it. When you catch the edge of a knife with your bare hand to stop it reaching your throat. Forensic scientists call these defensive wounds. And this one told them something crucial about timing, because the wound had already begun to heal. Healing takes days, which means the violence in Ötzi's final chapter didn't begin on the mountain where he died. It began at least a day or two earlier, somewhere lower down. He had already survived one close, brutal, hand-to-hand fight, grabbing a blade, bleeding, getting away, before the arrow ever found him. There was more: bruising, injuries to his chest, and evidence of trauma to his head, a blow or a fall, in the time around his death. This was a man who had been through something violent and sustained, not a single clean strike. And then there's the piece of evidence that pushes this from a killing into something that sounds almost impossible for the Copper Age: blood. When researchers analyzed Ötzi's equipment, his knife, his arrows, his coat, DNA testing turned up traces of blood that were not his own. And not from one other person, from 4 separate people. One person's blood on his flint knife, 2 more people's blood on a single one of his arrowheads, and a 4th person's blood on his coat. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because this is a real investigation, and real investigations have uncertainty. This DNA work is older, and some of it is considered suggestive rather than absolutely confirmed. But if it holds, it paints a staggering scene. The 2 different people's blood on one arrowhead suggests Ötzi shot someone, pulled the arrow back out of the body, and used it again on someone else, retrieving his ammunition mid-fight, the way a desperate man low on arrows would. The blood on his knife is his close quarters fighting, that defensive wound on his hand, the blade he was swinging. And the 4th person, the blood smeared across the shoulders of his coat? The leading interpretation is the most human detail of all. It's in the position you'd expect if Ötzi had carried a wounded companion across his back, if he was trying to get someone else out alive. This was not a lone man dying quietly. This was the end of a running battle. Ötzi fought, he wounded, he possibly killed, and he may have been trying to save someone, right up until an arrow in the back ended it. Act 4. His last meal. Here is the part of this case that I find genuinely haunting. Not the blood, not the arrow, the meal. Because Ötzi's body is so well preserved that scientists could examine the actual contents of his stomach. And in 2019, they did, and found it wasn't empty. It was full. Not long before he died, by the analysis, likely something on the order of half an hour to an hour beforehand, Ötzi sat down and ate a large meal. Dried meat from wild alpine animals. Grain. A rich, fatty, high-energy meal. The kind you eat when you need fuel for hard travel in the cold. Sit with what that means. This man had already been in one fight days before. He had a half-healed knife wound in his hand. If the blood evidence is right, he had recently been in a second bloody battle. He was being hunted through the mountains by people who wanted him dead. And somewhere near the top of a high alpine pass, exhausted, he stopped. He sat down in a relatively sheltered spot, and he ate. For a moment, his last moment of peace, he must have believed he was safe, that he'd made it high enough, far enough, that his pursuers had given up. You do not sit down to eat a heavy meal in the open if you think a killer is 30 meters behind you. But they hadn't given up. They had followed him up the mountain, and they had learned their lesson from the first fight. Because this time, there was no charging in with knives against a man who'd already proven he could kill them at close range. This time, they waited. They let him eat. They let him lower his guard. And then, from below and behind, While he sat with a full stomach and his weapons set aside, someone drew a bow and put an arrow through his back. He may have realized what was happening. There's a suggestion, from the position his body was found in, that in his final moments, he may have been trying to reach the arrow, to twist around and pull it out of his own shoulder, but the damage was done. He went down near his unfinished business, and the cold took the rest. Then the killer stepped over him, pulled the telltale shaft from the wound, and walked back down the mountain, and left one thing behind that changes everything about why. Act 5. Why? The case that will never close. When you investigate a murder, you look for motive. And usually, in the ancient world, when someone dies violently in a remote place, the motive is robbery. Someone wanted what they had. Except Ötzi's killer took almost nothing. Lying right there beside the body was that copper axe, one of the most valuable objects a person could own in that era, a status symbol, a tool worth, in the terms of the time, a small fortune. Any robber, any opportunistic killer would have taken it first. They left it. They left the axe. They left the bow. And they walked away from the single most valuable thing he owned. That tells us something chilling. This was not about theft. Nobody killed Ötzi to rob him, which leaves the darker motives, the personal ones. This was someone who wanted him dead specifically, not his possessions. A feud, a vendetta, revenge for that first fight, days earlier, where he'd already spilled blood. A conflict between groups, someone he knew, someone hunting a specific man across the mountains, with the patience to track him for days, the discipline to wait until his guard was down, and the presence of mind to hide the evidence afterward. And here is where the oldest cold case on Earth runs out of road. Because we have almost everything. We have the victim, down to his last meal and his brown eyes. We have the cause of death. We have the murder weapon. We have defensive wounds, a timeline, a sequence of events, even, possibly, the DNA of the people whose blood he shed. We have everything except a name. We will never know who fired that arrow. We'll never know what Ötzi did, or was accused of doing, that made someone hunt him to the roof of the world. We'll never know if it was justice or betrayal, or a war between families whose descendants might still be walking around today. The one piece every murder investigation needs, who and why, melted away with the glacier 5,000 years before the first detective was ever born. The trail didn't just go cold. It went cold before history started. And that's the thing that stays with me about the man in the ice. We like to imagine the deep past as simpler, gentler, people too busy surviving to hate each other the way we do. But Ötzi tells the truth. 5,300 years ago, before nations, before writing, before a single word of law was ever set down, a man was tracked, ambushed, and murdered in a way that was calculated, personal, and covered up. Vengeance is that old. Cunning is that old. The instinct to hunt down another human being and make sure you're never caught. That's as old as we are. He was somebody. He had a name once, spoken by people who loved him and people who feared him. He ate his last meal, believing he'd gotten away. And then, history's oldest killer proved that some of the very worst things about us aren't modern at all. They were already here, 5,000 years ago, waiting in the snow. If this case got under your skin, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.